Thank you, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here in person and speaking with colleagues again, face to face. This project is actually a very small part of a larger SSHRC-funded project on populism and labor. And of course, like most of us who are doing research over the past few years, we had to pivot and actually pay attention to COVID and its impacts on work for a lot of the things that we were looking at. Now, today's topic of before I get into what I'm going to talk about empirically, I'm just trying to frame about the pandemic challenges to workers and unions. And I don't think I have to say much more than it's already been said. People are already publishing on this topic. Of course, the impact of the pandemic on workers and their institutions is already being documented. And this is by no means a complete list. Unemployment and limited income support for workers, even in Canada, that of course reduces household consumption and income security for individuals. But of course, when unionized workers are not working, they don't pay dues. And that reduces the financial resources for unions. The gender and racialized inequality and intensification of so-called essential care work. We saw labor markets become increasingly fragmented and polarized, with racialized workers doing a lot of the work that required face-to-face interaction, getting more sick. And the work by Nora Laredo and Sarah Mojade at Toronto Star released today definitely backs that up. Transition to homework, a huge question for workers and what that means, but also very important for unions because unions have to start bargaining rules of homework, which they've already started to do at my home institution in York, for example. And then we get into the stuff I'm sort of interested more about: vaccine hesitancy and employment relations. If anybody knows any union rank and file staff member right now who's doing, especially ones in charges of arbitrations and grievances, they know reinstatement for workers who have refused vaccines is consuming a really significant amount of union time and resources. There were buyouts and retirements of senior staff, both in institutions and of all rank and file activists. And of course, like all societies, when you remove your elders from the institutions, you lose memory. And that's something that's had a big impact on unions I work with at the airport and many others. And of course, the impact of the pandemic on workers has been uneven. Who got sick and who didn't get sick, who got laid off and who did get, who maintained their job. Huge divisions in the public and private sector, for example. And also these divisions are manifested when it comes to anti-restriction sentiments, and the rank and file are among the rank and file, I think, are probably one of the unexplored and deepest political challenges for unions. How do you deal with rank and file that are increasingly frustrated by anti-restrictions or COVID restrictions in workplaces and in the broader community? Now, a little bit, because I'm going to talk about US cases today, New York and Seattle, just a little bit to set a foreground. I don't have a lot of time to get into detail, but there were relatively minor anti-lockdown protests in Seattle and New York in 2020, the first year of the pandemic. Now, of course, there's a lot of stuff going on in the US at this time. There was a small election in 2020 with a very divisive incumbent. I will not say his name. The Black Lives Matter protests were across US 2020 following the killing of George Floyd on May 25th in Minneapolis. And of course, in Seattle, one of the cities that I'm looking at today actually established an autonomous police-free zone during that protest. But even within a year later, by 2021, there were different types of protests starting to emerge in the US case. We are also very aware of them in Canada as well. There was an anti-restrictions protest in New York because as of November 1st, about a year ago, that's when the vaccination mandate for all city workers was going to be coming into effect, and you could be laid off or lose your job if you weren't vaccinated. There were protests around that. In October 2021, again, this time last year, Boeing workers also protested vaccination mandates outside of Seattle. Now, the anger, of course, manifested itself through 2022. Epidemics created new, and also always create new divisions for workers and as well as solidarities. And this is a research by a book that was released just before the pandemic started by Sam Kahn Jr., and where he argues that epidemics do create new divisions and new opportunities for solidarity in societies, going all the way back to the plague up to the HIV/AIDS crisis. And I think he also touches on SARS. Now, the anti-restrictions mandates, of course, were framed as attacks on personal freedom. So that's the way they were put out there by people who were leading these protests. And of course, we had the anti-restriction protests in February 2022, just this year, with a truckers convoy in Ottawa. And those protests spread to the US. They actually imported them back, with US truck drivers also engaged in what they call the People's Convoy, which was inspired by these protests. And there was also limited counter protest by organized labor in both the US and Canada. Union leadership sat this one out. They did not organize a counter protest, and there's reasons for that we can discuss. This is one of the small counter protests in the city of Toronto on February 20th, 2022. I'm not being judicious with my selection of the photo I took. There really weren't that many people there. And this is sort of, I want to understand, why do these things happen in the labor movement? And I'm turning now to my evidence and the union statements in New York and Seattle. And just a little bit of the method. There are two sites in the larger project. We picked New York and Seattle for reasons. Historically, very progressive, bastions for organized labor. New York and Seattle are ranked number 2 and 3 in the US in union density. Of course, Honolulu is number 1, but I didn't want to try to sneak that into a grant. Of course, these are Kushama, Sawant, and AOC are, of course, sort of typical of and representing of that sentiment. We looked at union statements for the first year and a bit of the pandemic. These aren't media releases. These are union statements that are put out through common press releases and or on their website. In New York, just aside the sample, we covered approximately 30 unions with almost 600 statements were analyzed. In Seattle, 37 unions with 329 statements analyzed. And we came up with about 27 pandemic themes that were sort of created through an esoteric combination of open and closed coding, because we wanted to see what the statements had, but we also were looking for specific things. The themes are coded as primary or secondary importance in each statement. And of course, some statements had multiple themes as well. And these are just some preliminary findings from that data. And I'll talk about where I think I'm going with it in the conclusion. I'm not going to read all the themes out to you, just to give you a little bit of a highlight. The ones in black were the ones that were most prominent. Okay, the ones in red were the ones that I wanted to find, but were actually quite not in the statements for that first year. And we'll get to the analysis in a bit. But some of these codes came up where some things that we wanted to look for, and others just we had to include them because they came up in the statements. We weren't really expecting them, so sort of a round up open coding. I'm going to go through this very quickly because I don't have a lot of time. Of course, I'm a geographer by training. I'm looking for geographical differences between the New York and Seattle, even though we selected them for their similarities. And we did find there was a little bit of difference. This is the percentage of the union statements referencing the selected issue. Of course, not to be surprising, masking at this time for that first year and ventilation workplace safety were number 1 and 2. But then you get into paid sick days. Again, they were quite popular in New York and Seattle. Small difference. Hazard pay was a bigger deal in Seattle than it was in New York. They called for more testing. Of course, New York was hit particularly hard by the epidemic as well. But generally not a big difference when you look at that level. However, when we start looking a little bit deeper, we looked at where would people want government support from during the pandemic? And of course, New York wanted the local government to come through. Of course, New York being a big global city, it has those resources. Seattle doesn't. Their resources are going to state and federal level as well. So that's just a small geographic difference that can, I think, be explained. But then we start disaggregating the data and looking at different sectors or unions representing big groups. And we see some pretty striking differences. These are the top issues. You can see percentage of the statements that mention them. So just a little quickly, for those of you who don't know the American alphabet soup, the WEA, that's the teachers. We'll just call them teachers. WSNA, we'll call them the nurses. And then we have the Teamsters and the food and commercial workers. And we can see there's some little differences here. Of course, the nurses really big on wanting masking because there was a shortage at the beginning. And of course, the Teamsters a little bit less concerned. They're more concerned with other things. The bigger issues were a little bit unpaid sick days. And of course, not unconcerned with masking and ventilation, but the public sector unions had slightly different top issues. These are just the top issues. I didn't put the percentages by, but these were dominant by comparing the unions I just mentioned, plus their New York equivalents. Teachers, nurses, retail, and I can't leave out 32 BG SEIU. We know what they're involved in, services and healthcare. And just I don't have the time to go through each and every difference, but you can see the public sector unions again, very different priorities in terms of what they were interested in that first year. They wanted more masking, ventilation, safety. They appealed to the state governments. Only the teachers were interested in keeping their workplaces closed. The other unions didn't mention it at all. Okay, so we can see here where we're getting at. In words of time, I'm going to have to really go through here quickly. We're getting to sectionalism. We're getting that these statements actually show that the unions were representing the unique local, hence the title of my paper, issues that the workers that they represent were interested in. And these are just a couple of quotes from 32 BGA who wanted support for, of course, the airline industry because they represent all those workers at LaGuardia. Another one below is from the Seattle-based union of SPEA. And of course, they wanted a bailout for the aerospace industry in Seattle. Again, just showing, and this came up again and again, very sectionalist demands. And that gets me to the silences. Again, the scale on this graph is different. I had up to 45% on one of them. This one's only 6. So this is very few mentions of these things that I thought were interesting. Calls to open the economy, not that many, New York and Seattle. Calls to close the economy, a little bit in New York, not much in Seattle. But very little mention on things like being for stimulus checks, for vaccination at work, being pro-gig worker, supporting actions. Again, what I would consider to be more class-based demands. Again, hinting at, I think, the sectionalism we can find in these two cases. Now, this leads then to anti-vaccine mandates, which I don't think is surprising. In the US, the nurses were, this is from their position in the first year, the nurses are against anti-vaccine mandates. They are in Canada too, by the way. Mediated their position a little bit in Ontario. The nurses don't think that people should be forced to be vaccinated. Again, there's a long history of that. In New York, SEIU 32BJ, their position was, we really want our workers to get vaccinated, but we don't think they should have to. Again, they weren't pro-vaccination. So that gets to the question then, what explains this? Well, if you go back and look at the sectionalist demands, I think vaccination mandates are a class issue. I know people can debate me. I debate workers all the time on this point, but I do think it's an argument that can be made. So what am I getting at here? Well, one, just to sum up, only minor differences between Seattle and New York when the unions are taken as a whole, but when you break them down by sector or by union, you start seeing a little bit different pattern. The emphasis again was on particular needs of members that were arising at the time. Calls were largely workplace specific, very little emphasis on the class-based calls in the statements. They just weren't there very often. And in the first year, the unions were relatively silent on issues that would emerge in 2022. Now, Project Warp Speed in the US was ongoing. They knew vaccines were coming, but unions didn't think about it. And then all of a sudden they were introduced and then they were caught by surprise, which I think is interesting. And that I think that's relevant. That happened in the following months. But I guess the concluding point is that the overall lesson for unions in this crisis is that there needs to be preemptive work in education that can mobilize a class-based response to pandemic policies, such as fighting against or 04 closures, trying to educate workers on what is a proper position, class position, and class-informed position on vaccination mandates. And this wasn't contained in the US, in two of the more densely unionized states in the in America. Thank you very much.